Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Kabir, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to you. And I know you're very busy churning out articles and most importantly, those critical pieces that you write. So I'll start by introducing you to our audience. So Kabir Taneja is a researcher and writer based in Delhi. He's connected with the Observer Foundation ORF, and his work focuses on India's relation with the Middle East, specifically looking at security dimensions faced by transnational jihadist groups. His bylines and posts appear regularly. And thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So the first and the obvious question: when you're working in a newspaper and you're writing pieces, so what has this? Why were you attracted to a Middle Eastern group fighting for something?
See, that's a good question. I get that asked a lot. Comes from a very sort of underreported and understudied area of Indian foreign policy in general, right? So, I mean, if you talk about foreign policy, it's much more sexier to study European Union or the United States and nuclear security or Pakistan, which all of us are experts on. So, everyone is very intensely concentrated on these particular regions. But the Middle East is very important to us, right? It's, we have, as you're seeing right now with the evacuations taking place due to COVID-19, there are more than 8 million Indians that work in the region, responsible for sending back $60 billion into our economy, which is nearly our annual defense budget costs. And majority of our energy security is derived from the relative stability of the Middle East. Because if there's no stability in the Middle East, you can't pump oil out and you can't ship it out. So a lot rides on a lot of it rides on the Middle East. It's just that in Indian discourse, people just tend to not realize it. For them, it's mostly okay. Fine, we have a bunch of migrants working there. Not beyond that. It's much more beyond that. And that just garnered my interest. It's a gap in foreign policy studies, nothing else.
So, for all our viewers, we will have a subsequent episode more on ISIS, but since this is the first episode we're recording, so for all the viewers and listeners who might not have a very in-depth understanding of ISIS, you can just give a brief, like your understanding of ISIS. You have been reporting for so long. So, what's your brief understanding of ISIS is and their activities?
Right. Well, there's nothing brief about it, but I will try my best. So, of course, the Islamic State, as we know it today, is a group that was formed out of what earlier was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And when the Arab Spring came through, there were protests in Syria at that point of time in 2010, 2011. Which created a lot of vacuum, a lot of political vacuum and security vacuum in the country as people took to the streets against the Assad government. And in these vacuum, the Islamic Al-Qaeda in Iraq sort of very slowly started planting its operations, conducting attacks and so on and so forth. And of course, at that time there was a guy called Zarqawi who was the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he was given the mandate by Osama bin Laden himself, despite bin Laden actually not liking the guy too much, because he had quite a mind of his own. And Al-Qaeda is a very hierarchical organization. It's very old school that way when it comes to challenges to the hierarchy. And Zarqawi always thought that Al-Qaeda is a very slow organization, that we should that Al-Qaeda should not constrict itself in attacking only Israeli and American targets. They should aim for much higher body count as far as the American interest, larger interest in the Middle East are concerned. So attacking the Saudis, attacking the Hashemite kingdom in Jordan, anything that comes their way, basically. And there was large sort of disagreements to that. But Zarqawi, because of his very sort of extremist ideology, uh, had his own sort of fan following also. But he was still a very sort of low level commander in Iraq for Al Qaeda. And then after the 2003 invasion of the US of Iraq and the subsequent sort of congressional inquiries that happened, in one of the inquiries at that time, General Colin Powell was testifying, brought up Zarqawi as a very sort of central figure of why we needed to attack Iraq. That these kind of terrorists are there, and Zarqawi was a low-level commander, and he was basically served on a silver platter to create his own ecosystem. He suddenly had a brand, and he was brandishing all this beyond that. So that's sort of the nascent stages of the Islamic State, and from this sort of ecosystem and this thought process that developed, that we need to be more violent, we need to be more aggressive, and we need to be those who actually come out with the Khilafat, so to call. People like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi came through. And you have to remember that Baghdadi was not like Zarqawi. He was not a low-level commander. He was not a Zarqawi had a criminal background of petty theft and violence in the streets and so on and so forth. Baghdadi was had a PhD. He was a doctorate student, and he had very deep knowledge about Islam, about the Quran, and so on and so forth. And that gave him a lot of weight of being a leader of such an organization. So that's how it started, and it's very rare to be in a situation as a researcher or as a journalist or as so on and so forth to witness both the rise and fall of such a drastic group in a period of 5 years. Right, Al Qaeda has risen and risen and risen, suffered setbacks, but still sort of maintained its longevity. This was like a very Hollywood version of Al Qaeda, which took place. So that's just a very quick sort of summary of how it started.
All right, sir. I wanted to ask one thing. When we learn about ISIS and Al Qaeda, so there is one difference between ISIS and Al Qaeda. Correct me if I'm not wrong. Al Qaeda never had this a motive of establishing a caliphate. But Zarqawi, Abu Musa al-Zarqawi, on the other hand, was very eager to establish a caliphate, which was contradictory to the Al Qaeda's cause, if I'm not wrong. So, what led to this transition from being a part of Al Qaeda, then going against the part of Al Qaeda, and finally dissing Osama bin Laden and the whole organization while establishing their own organization, which calls for a global caliphate.
Yeah, so there is a slight misconception to that statement that Al Qaeda didn't aim for a caliphate. So if you see some of the initial papers that Al Qaeda developed while the organization was developing in the 90s, before they started operating in the Sudan and parts of Africa, where Bin Laden basically portrayed himself as a philanthropist. So if you go to Western press, older Western press, you can see these articles of him sort of making a road for the community and so on and so forth, all that kind of narratives. And but if you see the initial mandate that Al Qaeda developed and the papers from that time, they aim for a caliphate. They do not, in any sort of shape or form, deny that ultimately they want a universal Islamic Ummah. And under that, there will be a caliphate that they will run. So the caliphate was always part of Al Qaeda thinking, and that was not part of it was not a thing that they did entertain. But working towards the caliphate, they took their time. They were much more. Bin Laden himself was much more focused and almost obsessed with the American power in the Middle East. He was obsessed with the fact that the American power empowers Israel in the Middle East. And he wanted that to change first. So his aim was regional instead of being global, sort of,
Global.
just taking your 5 tanks and going to Rome or something. So, but the caliphate was always a central part of Al Qaeda thinking as well. It's just that they were working in a far more methodological manner than the manner in which we saw the Islamic State work.
So the other thing which I wanted to ask you is, so why did what did the Islamic State do right, which the Al-Qaeda failed, so that it attracted more foreign fighters or more foreign sympathizers to join the Islamic State?
Okay, that's a good question again. And I don't think they did anything right. I mean, who's surviving right now? Right. It is Al Qaeda that is surviving right now. Zawahiri is still around. He's still living somewhere, either in Pakistan or Afghanistan. He's maintained his position. He's maintained his sanctity of his life. The Americans haven't bumped him off yet. And one of the when the Islamic State sort of started taking territory, they were very smart about it. So it's not like it was a bunch of just hooligans running amok with no large scale plan per se. It was actually fairly well planned. And the people running it at the top, as I said, people like Baghdadi and all that, they was, for the lack of a better term for a terrorist, they were smart terrorists. They knew what they were doing. They knew the landscape. They knew the sectarian divides that they can exploitate their own sort of what they want to achieve in those regions. So when one of the big push that Islamic State got at that point of time, when I think it was 2014 or 15, you'll have to just double check that. But when the Americans decided to disband the Iraqi army, which created and not just disband, they also said that the next avatar of the Iraqi army will not have space for Sunnis, which meant that there were hundreds or thousands of Sunni fighters from the army with nothing left to do. But not just nothing left to do, they were also suddenly a minority against a new Shia-based ecosystem that was running Baghdad. And yeah, and you even if you are Sunni, it's not like you can just go to Saudi Arabia and claim asylum and they will give it to you. Yeah, so you ultimately had to protect yourself. And the only way to protect yourself at that point of time was to join the Islamic State. So initially, when you see the first governors that came up when Islamic State took over Tikrit and Mosul and the cities in northern Iraq, they were all former Iraqi army members. And in fact, they were all Baathists. So if you remember, there were 39 Indian people that were taken hostage by Islamic State in Iraq, and eventually their sort of remains were found. The first sort of outreach that India did out of its consulate in Kurdistan, in Erbil, was to these governors, these ISIS governors, because India knew them from the part when they were Baathist generals in the Saddam army, and India had very good relation with Saddam's Iraq. So so these are the guys who were earlier at one side but went to the other side to protect themselves and for the lack of better options. And even when Mosul and Tikrit fell to the Islamic State, it's not like the Islamic State went in the beginning, brandishing Kalashnikovs to everyone's face. They went in taking food, they went in taking fuel, they went in taking medicines, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, when the army disbanded and there was a distance between the Shias and the Sunnis, the northern parts of Iraq were suddenly left to their own vices, and expecting sort of violence against them because they are Sunnis. They said, fine, if the Islamic State is something we don't agree with, but if they're going to protect us in the near future, we are okay with them being in our cities. Of course, that didn't turn out well for the locals as well, considering how Islamic State operates. So it was a culmination of a whole bunch of things happening geopolitically, domestic politically, regionally at that point of time, and ISIS just very smartly took full advantage of that.
Because the other thing is, do you think, as an organizational level, what ISIS operates is very different from Al Qaeda? If you go to the organizational level, they has Hizbah for the local police commander who takes care of more theological Quranic stuff, whether they're following the Sharia laws or not.
Yeah.
Do you think this was a thing which Al Qaeda couldn't properly instill in their organization? One. The other thing is the use of internet. which ISIS probably had done much better than Al-Qaeda. Probably that time Al-Qaeda didn't have access to internet during Bin Laden's time, but with recent things. Do you think this is one of the other important reasons why ISIS as an organization gained more popularity than Al-Qaeda?
Right. Look, it's again, we're coming to the fact that both Islamic State and Al Qaeda were fairly different. It's Al Qaeda never managed to get a quasi state against them. So they never had a quasi state to govern in a very structured manner where there are governors, there is local police implementing Sharia, there are local taxes, there are local laws that are built by Islamic State for those cities, towns, and so on and so forth. So if you go and let's say look at some of the work that Rukmani Kalamaki has done for New York Times, she has documents of how they have separate sort of taxation systems, separate systems for public amenities, health, and so on and so forth. And everyone was sort of forced to work with them because of a lack of option, right? You couldn't just take a flight out of Mosul suddenly and leave. So I think so. There was a vast difference between that. But Al Qaeda knew that they want a caliphate for them, but they also knew that their particular larger area of operations was Afghanistan and Yemen at that point of time, where you just cannot put a quasi-state together. Right? The quasi-state came up in Syria and Iraq because no one expected it to be there. And suddenly, when this started happening, when Islamic State started taking territory, they started taking over, existing state structures such as banking, for example. When Islamic State took over Mosul, the first order of the day was to break into Mosul Bank and steal $450 million cash. Now imagine a quasi-state like that has $450 million in it, and that can go on for a long period of time. That's a heavy amount of money. And it's not just that; they also took over oil refineries. I remember they actually used to, in 2014-15 when we were covering this, they actually used to release proper advertisement for oil engineers for refineries that were under them, and they were paying upward of $100,000 for engineers, and that's a damn good salary, right? So they were working in a very state-like structure. They were like, look, these are our laws. You'll have to live like this and that and all, but you'll still make money out of this if you come and work for us. And a lot of people did at that point of time. It's not unheard of in that part of the world. So geography made a lot of difference at that point of time, right? Taking over already existing smuggling routes, for example, where oil was being smuggled out of very small makeshift refineries in central Syria to Turkey and being sold in the international market. So that was also happening. Interesting point here also India was one of the countries that had invested in those regions in oil along with China, and we had to abandon our fields there. So that's how they were working there. Geography was really playing a very important part in their successes at that point of time. And of course, coming to the sort of online part of the debate. Again, online radicalization using online space for propaganda is not something that ISIS started. You have to remember that there seems to believe that they were the ones that they started all this. It was their sort of homegrown plan, so to speak. The first event which was covered widely, promoted widely, which was a terror event, was by Al-Shabaab in Kenya during the Westgate Mall siege, where they live tweeted the entire thing. But they did live tweeted it while not many people knew that this was possible. So not many people actually followed what they were tweeting like. But there was one guy who was there, who was just live tweeting pictures and all that kind of stuff while this was taking place. So it started then. And even if you go back to 2003, 2004, and you see some of the rehabilitation programs of radicals around the world. Singapore was one country that had a rehabilitation program that had an online component to it as well, of what people were reading online. There was no social media there then, but people would still put up like pages of sermons and all that kind of stuff on online for people to read and share links and so on and so forth. So it's not new. The only thing that ISIS did was, because they had such good expertise thanks to the foreign fighters coming in from Europe, from the States, Canada, all over the world, like 100 countries or so. They could use this sort of these foreign fighters coming in and say, look, what is the best way to create the best propaganda possible? How do we create the name ISIS as the biggest brand in the world so that it even sort of eclipses Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. So if you see from 2014 to 2016, at a point of time, they were, I think, releasing a terabyte of propaganda per 2 days. So that's about 500 GBs per day, right? And there was an argument at that point of time also that they're going to exhaust their strategy very soon because that's just way too much stuff that they're putting out. And another thing they did is when they started getting territory, all these fighters who were coming in from abroad were getting straight to commander positions and the topmost military generals within the Islamic State and all. Like, for example, when the couple of Indians that managed to make it there from Maharashtra and Kerala and so forth, were told to be the water boys and fix buildings and so on and so forth. So once these guys came in from outside, they brought a lot of expertise with them. But while they got all like top ranks in Islamic State on the ground, what the Islamic State also did was in 2014, they released a document which basically said that the document was titled, I think, Online Warrior, You Are a Mujahid too, or something to that order, which basically gave the online person who's trying to radicalize people on behalf of Islamic State a military rank so that it's equitable to a guy fighting on the ground. So what they are doing is not diminished by the fact that you're just sitting at home on Telegram, Twitter, or Facebook at that point of time and disseminating propaganda, trying to hire people, and so on and so forth. But you are equally important to what the ground fighter is. And I think that kind of motivation building amongst its online sympathizers really worked out. So a lot of people were very diligently spending time on Twitter and Facebook trying to build ecosystem for the Islamic State. So again, they were very smart strategies, a lot of which just came off from the fact that people who implemented these strategies were foreign fighters who had worked in the Western world and in the Western economies and where marketing and that kind of stuff is used on a daily basis.
All right, so that was pretty insightful about getting to know about ISIS's strategy. So there is one more organization which is Sunni Pan-Islamic organization, but Deobandi in nature. I'm talking about Taliban here. About 2.5 decades back, they also did somewhat very similar to ISIS. They occupied the whole region. They fought with the Northern Alliances. They fought with warlords, and the whole movement took a great position throughout the country. And they finally captured Kabul in 1996. And very similar to what ISIS has done in Iraq and Syria by capturing and occupying the most strategic locations, Taliban also did the very similar. So how
Yeah.
can we make a difference? How can we make a difference here between the Taliban style of governance and ISIS style of governance, given that they both are very brutal in nature? ISIS might be more brutal in nature. Taliban might be a little moderate, but there are still differences that our viewers would like to know about both the organization. And
Yeah.
one more short question was, how is the governing councils, like Taliban had a shura and
Yeah.
they had ulema, they had their own jirga council and everything. How was this governing council and work structure different from that of ISIS?
Right. Okay. So, the Taliban example is actually fairly different to what the Islamic State was,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
You have to remember that Islamic State fighters are still called the Islamists and the jihadists and all. The Taliban fighters are always called mujahideens. And why they're called mujahideen is this because there is a semblance of acceptance of what they are doing, right? So when they were sort of brought together in the late 80s, the aim was to kick Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. That was the aim, right? The entire Taliban movement was pushed through to push the Soviets out, which they succeeded over a period of
Right.
time.
Right.
But you have to also remember that the Taliban movement, when it started, was aided by the Pakistanis as a state policy and the Americans. because the Americans did not want to go boots on the ground. So they needed to create a force that will be able to push the Soviet Unions out. At that time, it was the Cold War. There was sort of, it was a no holds bar situation. You had to basically fight the Soviet Union wherever they were active, wherever they were planning to build a sort of communist ecosystem, and so on and so forth. So, so there was a lot of legitimacy attached to the Taliban movement at that point of time. That, oh, we are creating this sort of group of student warriors. So ultimately, Taliban is what? Taliban means student, and they will be fighting against the oppressors, which is the Soviet Union. So that was how it was created, right? And of course, like as it goes in these policies where you build one evil to defeat another evil, it usually comes back to bite you at some point of time, which we have seen for the past 19 years happening now with the Americans. So, so I think there is a drastic difference between the two. The Taliban has always been a sort of conglomeration of local warlords. It started with the Pashtuns of Pakistan, but now there's a differentiation between the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, right? The Afghan Taliban believes they are the custodians of the Afghan land, and they were the ones that ran the government when Mullah Omar was around in the 90s. In fact, if your viewers would be very interested, there was a article recently on basically dissecting the first Taliban constitution in 1998 of how that was. It's only 15, 16 pages or something like that, so not very big clearly, but it showed sort of what kind of thinking they had of governing their land. And ultimately, you also have to remember that Afghanistan has always been a theater of conflict between tribes. It goes back much beyond the modern boundaries that we see even in the Middle East when the Sykes-Picot came in 1916, when the French and the British divided territory amongst themselves. But the Afghan landscape has always been like what it is right now. It's never been cohesive. It's very difficult to get everyone into one room and install ceasefires or other such mechanisms for the fighting to stop. And the fact that the Taliban was built there to push back the Soviets was easy because this landscape was like that itself. So you throw in some money, you throw in some weapons, you throw in some political clout, and you can sort of build this together. And even if you see it today, the main shuras of the Taliban are all in Pakistan. Almost none.
Quetta Shura.
Yeah, Quetta is the main one, but there are other four others that are all in Pakistan. So Taliban is a whole different ball game, and comparing it to Islamic State is fairly a very sort of loose end in the way why both insurgencies exist. The Taliban had always said, okay, look, the Afghan territory is our territory. We are not fighting for the larger Islamic Ummah. We are not. So even when the Islamic State came about, the Taliban didn't have any sort of eye to eye with them. They said, look, that's what you're doing is what you're doing, and they actually had disagreements with Al-Qaeda as well. And Al-Qaeda was strongly based in Afghanistan at that point of time. So, there is no umbrella arguments around this. Not every jihadist movement is fighting on the same wavelength. They are almost sparring always with each other. The aims are different. How those aims should be achieved are different. So that has to be kept in mind as far as any sort of comparisons are driven between these two groups and both conflict zones as well.
Okay. So the other thing which I wanted to ask you is the very good thing that ISIS has managed is to capture the media attention. So whether it's Rukmini Kalinachi writing pieces for New York Times and having a separate New York Times having a separate beat called the ISIS beat, which she generally writes, or whether it's sending in reporters to the Middle East to just report about ISIS, or whether ISIS giving even access to Vice News in early 2014, 2015 for shooting an entire documentary to show what the things that are going in between. So what is the strategy for giving the media access, right, of this? And right now what we see as well, we get to know ISIS work only through Amaq Nuke Agency, right? So
Yeah.
much of the work we don't know what goes behind, whether it's true or not, might be exaggerated.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's a good question again. And see, as far as the media landscape goes, ISIS played it very professionally. Like there are very few organizations who have played the media against itself, right? Because they made a big story of themselves. And as a media organization, are you not going to cover it? Of course, you're going to cover it. If it makes it into the front page, you would send your reporters because it makes it to the front page. And the Islamic State realized that the best way to build a brand is to make sure that you're on the front pages around the world. That's something even Al Qaeda has never managed to do. And let's be honest, Al Qaeda also had beats in American newspapers and news channels earlier. ABC did a interview with Osama bin Laden, I think in early 2000s or late 90s, and that media outreach has always been part of this ecosystem. It's just that interviewing bin Laden at that point of time was much more difficult because Al Qaeda always worked in a certain manner of how they approach their group, and Islamic State was much more brash in what they were trying to do. And you also, like, I remember there was an Italian journalist who was captured by the Islamic State for a couple of months, and he was released 2017 or something, and he gave an interview to BBC, and he came out and he said, I just cannot believe how well they played us, the journalists, like because he stayed with them at that point of time in captivity for some time, so maybe he got to see the workings. But ultimately what happened, it got so mainstreamed that even if Amak News says, today we bombed an entire city with 50,000 donuts, that'll still probably make it to the front pages. Because why? Because you are literally feeding news to the news outlets. There is no way those news outlets can confirm whether this is true or not. You can't just drive into Aleppo or something like that, and a reporter can talk to the locals and say whether what's happening is true or not. So your fact checking comes down to a very basic exercise. And what Amak was releasing at that point of time, or still does, I mean, even if they release it now, it still makes it to the news. And they use that to their advantage. They even try to take claim for things like the Las Vegas gun attack that happened 2-3 years ago, I think, which had nothing to do by hundreds and thousands of miles with Islamic State. But they still try to do it because they said, okay, fine, at that point of time, we have lost our territory, we are getting bombarded by air by the Americans and the Russians at the same time. And the Kurds are making great progress against us on the ground because of the air power. How do we maintain our presence? So if you can't do it physically and you lose your caliphate, you lose your territory, you're forced to go back as a guerrilla warfare insurgency. The best way to do it is what was working for you before is by online means, by manipulating the media space, and so on and so forth. So they started taking claims of attacks that people were not even sure is Islamic State or not. And we don't have to go too far behind for that. If you see the immediate debates after the Sri Lanka attack last year in 2019, in April 2019, on Easter weekend, when that attack took place, there was there were some videos of these guys giving bayat to Baghdadi and all that kind of stuff. But for us, unless that bayat is accepted, Islamic State doesn't know about it. So it's totally plausible that sympathizers of the group, of their ideology, conduct an attack and then ask Islamic State, please take it. Please own it because you've done it in your name. Now, that is a very easy proposition for ISIS. They will say, yes, you did it in our name. It becomes an Islamic State attack, 250 people died, it looks great for them. But it's not necessary that the Islamic State central hierarchy actually knew what these guys were up to, or they had told these guys, okay, please go and blow up 5 different places in Sri Lanka. So and that's how the media sort of narrative was working at that point of time. They didn't need to actually spend money on anything. If someone is conducting a knife attack in a town in Germany and leaves behind a video saying I did it for ISIS, ISIS will claim it the second day. With this. Same thing happened with the attack in Florida nightclub, where a couple of people died. So even on the media game, I mean, it's a case study. I hope they teach it at universities of how well they did it. It's quite amazing.
So now let's come to the part of the ISIS in South Asia, the book which you have written. Firstly, it's a lovely book because we generally don't get to read a lot about ISIS in South Asia because Western media has always proved it to be a clash between the Eastern and the Western side. So South Asia has always been avoided as such. So I'm referring to a chapter from your book, Kashmir to Kerala,
Yeah.
ISIS and its relative, in which you mentioned about the summer of 2014 when a map circulated where for the first time, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan was given a tag of Khorasan, the Khorasan tag, and probably the first time people got to know about ISIS and its ideology of establishing a Khilafat. So, we tell us about it. And
Yeah. Sure. So, I mean, that map that we saw was about, I think, a month or 2 months before Baghdadi went to Al Nuri Mosque in Mosul and officially said, okay, they're a Khilafat now and all that. So this had started sort of floating around. And if you see the map itself, it's not a detailed map in any shape or form. It's not even has no boundary sense to it. It's just a big black sort of Islamic State flag going through the Middle East and South Asia and all that. So, but that showed you a little bit of their intent, right? And that showed you also the fact that they really don't care that Afghanistan is Al Qaeda stronghold. So they were ready to sort of battle that out also, which is a very old rivalry, as we said. But of course, the map, if you see, it doesn't uh, cover necessarily the entire Indian subcontinent. It stops at Kashmir. So, and it's very, very interesting because Kashmir, ideally, if you see it from a non-critical lens, makes sense for something like ISIS to sort of sprout out of, considering that it's already a conflict zone. It's a conflict zone based on land. It's a conflict zone based on ideology, religion. Everything is there to be sort of tapped into. So, but if you see the sort of lot of ISIS propaganda at that point of time, you see a lot of ISIS documents from that point of time. You see their sermons, you see their shaheeds and all that kind of stuff. Kashmir never gets mentioned. So, and that raises a lot of questions at that point of time. Also, is why is it so? That why is Kashmir not finding a central argument is in Islamic State's broader, global dominance strategy and so on and so forth. And we only found the answer to this 2 years later, while going through some court records in India, where the Indian security forces had interrogated a guy who was from a well-to-do family, well-educated, and fairly nuanced by the looks of the court documents at least, and knew what he was talking about. And they asked him quite point blank. They were like, "Achha, theek hai. Like, you guys are working on setting up Islamic State sort of modules in various parts of the world and so on and so forth. But why not Kashmir? Why are you not interested in Kashmir?" And he said, well, you know what? Kashmir is a battle between the non-believers and the patriots and nationalists. It's a battle for land. It's not a battle for Islam. So, and that's a convoluted way of going about it. So he said, the non-believers, of course, they are the Indian army, and the nationalists and the patriots is the Pakistani government, Pakistani army, the Lashkar, Hizbul, whoever you want to club into that sphere. And he said, we don't want to get into this right now. And I think it comes from the fact of two things. First is, of course, capacity. If you're getting into that kind of conflict, which is possibly the most militarized piece of land on the world, you better be prepared with both your depth as a fighting force and your financial and military capabilities. So. And it's not for the lack of trying. It's in one of the earliest cases in India of pro-Islamic State sort of camaraderie online between one guy sitting in Afghanistan, another sitting in Bangladesh, and a very poor shop owner in Kolkata. And this Kolkata fellow got hold of some money from the Bangladesh fellow, and his job was to commit reconnaissance missions in India, which included Delhi and Kashmir. Delhi, of course, he did his sort of rounds and so on and so forth, Connaught Place, the malls, and Vasant Kunj, and all that kind of stuff. And in Kashmir, this was when the larger sort of stone pelting cases were happening, 2015, 16. You remember it was quite a tinderbox at that point of time. And this guy then said, okay, fine, this is a great opportunity to now understand of how Islamic State's brand is working out here, or what do people think of the Islamic State. And he took a very poorly made flag. And if you wave that flag in Islamic State, you'll probably get chastised for it because it was imagery was wrong. But but if you take that flag, so he took that flag to one of the stone pelting cases in Srinagar. So if you go back to that year, and if you see the initial reports that came of flag waving, Islamic State flag waving in Kashmir, where which caused a full, ruckus in the Indian media and all that. It was this one shop owner from Kolkata, and his only job was to basically see what kind of reaction happens there. When he did that, he got beaten red, black, and blue by the locals because that's not the narrative that they wanted. They knew that okay, if this flag starts to showing up, why they are doing stone pelting or what their reasons are, which are very Kashmiri reasons. They have nothing to do with the Ummah, they have nothing to do with Islamic State, they have nothing to do with Syria, Iraq, so on and so forth. That will get watered down very quickly. And I think they realized this at a point of time. So you didn't see a lot of this in Kashmir, at least at that point of time. Later on, the argument still stands that it's now a possibility that AQIS, Islamic State, and all these can find some, and I'm talking theoretically here, right? There's no examples of it yet, but theoretically, they can find space for themselves in the Kashmir conflict because the separatist movement is almost over. The separatist movement, and there is a fatigue within Kashmiris fighting for, as quote unquote, Azadi as they speak there. There is a fatigue that okay, the separatists are clearly just not achieving anything. So we need to start looking for other things. And the other things when people look for in these kind of situations are going to be things like Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. We saw the whole Zakir Musa thing happening in the middle, and AQIS suddenly brandishing its brand everywhere in Kashmir. I was in Srinagar last year. You go to Dal Lake and great shops around, but almost every fourth shutter had Musa printed on it. So all that kind of narratives now is a possibility because call it hindsightedness of our Kashmir policy or whatever it is, but dismantling the state structures like that just because it was an electoral sort of give out that they had to do, and putting political leaders in jail, creating a vacuum that they didn't fill up, but they didn't allow anywhere else to fill up. So it's going to get filled up somewhere, right? And now I take you back to my examples in Mosul. Why did ISIS manage to succeed there? Because there was no political capital. It was just a vacuum, and they could just install themselves there. So that's the thing that can sort of, veer off as far as the Kashmir conflict is concerned. But as far as the conflict remains concrete in its sort of ground reality, which is fight for the land between India, Pakistan, and the separatists, I don't think these groups have much of a chance.
It was 2016 as we're talking about. There also the very first mention of Islamic State came in from the terrorist group of Burhan Wani. That probably the first time I've heard that he wants to establish an Islamic State. 2016, and post that as you're saying there were flags being shown, and you have went as well. And I was reading in your book, you have went to places that were written ISIS homeland, ISIS state, something around that region. So firstly, there were rumors about something called an ISJK that exists in Kashmir and operates. Firstly, there was you spoke about the book as well. You talk about other interviews as well that it cannot be possible in that region, and about a lot of local militants that groups that function as well, whether it's Jaish Muhammad, whether it's Lashkar-e-Taiba, whether it's Hizbul Mujahideen, which has doesn't have a aim to establish a Khilafat, which is just a land ownership we're talking about. Do you think, as an ideology of ISIS can sustain one, and does ISJK exist, or can it exist in future?
Right. Okay. So the initial narratives of ISJK, when they started coming about, they appeared in the press first rather than appearing in the field first, right? And that was a very problematic thing. I tried to highlight it at that point as well, that if you start saying something exists, it will exist. Whether it exists on the ground or not is a completely different theory. And we know how police and the militaries in conflict zones work. I mean, it's not easy to build something up for yourself if it helps your larger aims. So even when the ISJK brand was being thrown left, right, and center by the JNK police at that point of time, the like there was no structure that existed called ISJK. Now you have to understand from a law enforcement perspective of how much rope are you going to give these guys. And if you start from the beginning by saying, look, we understand how Islamic State's hierarchies work, you cannot be an official vilayat of the Islamic State outside the Khilafat unless you give a bias to Baghdadi and Baghdadi accepts it, right? So even ISK Khorasan, which gave a bayat in 2017, was accepted only a few months before Baghdadi was killed. So that's a 1.5 year period where they first thinking about what's happening in ISK, because there are various factions working there, including the Pakistanis, the TIP from Central Asia, and so on and so forth. So unless that entire sort of process happens, you should not legitimize anything, because that's your chance and to build a counter narrative delegitimizing an entire narrative, right? So you can say, look, we know the process. So just because you're standing up and saying I am ISJK doesn't make you ISJK. You're just your local miscreant or your local Lashkar guy who didn't get much bhav from the Lashkar-e-Taiba itself, and he wanted to be a commander at the age of 21 but couldn't make it, so started brandishing a flag which is going to give him notoriety within the valley as an IS member. You have to. It was a whole sort of package of understanding how Islamic State works, how its propaganda works, and how its branding works. Initially, when the ISJK thing was coming up, it was what? It was a flag that said Islamic State JNK, right? There was no hierarchy around it. It was basically saying Islamic State is what I support, JNK is where I live. That's it. That doesn't make it into an entity saying, oh, ISJK is here. Although how our press works, and I've been part of the press, so I know it makes an excellent headline. So it gets through. But at that point of time, there were also, you can see it from a perspective of how would you fight an insurgency in a place like Kashmir if you are a state, or if you're a police, or if you're military. If the ISJK comes up and you know that, okay, no one is actually from IS, they're all local militants that we know who have tried to join Lashkar, who tried to join Hizbul because they want to fire Kalashnikovs in the air and have fun and all that. What's the best way to get rid of them? If you get rid of them under the ISJK banner, no one is going to question you that, oh, wait, who was that? Was it actually an Lashkar militant? Where does his family live? What happened? X, Y, Z, and all. Islamic State, ISIS militant killed in Kashmir is sufficient enough. And so that's one probability that strategically would allow, let's say, the paramilitary forces to let this fester a little bit, because it makes counterinsurgency a bit easier and palatable to the public. So there are a host of issues, but hierarchically, there never has existed an ISJK that has been recognized by the Islamic State. Unless someone recognizes it, it's all kite flying and nothing else. And it needs to be shown in that light, so that you are delegitimizing an entity which doesn't even exist instead of legitimizing it.
All right. So you spoke about a vacuum that
Yeah.
existed in the case of Iraq and Syria, that was supposed to be where ISIS accommodated itself. But when we talk in the context of Afghanistan, can you please tell us the vacuum was present there? If I'm not wrong, the first that came was villages of Ghazni and most of the northern areas. And also, sir, I would like to know about the influx of foreign nationals into the Khorasan movement, how they are coming and why they are coming, and the whole idea of gaining possible grounds in Afghanistan. How are they decoding it? Can you
Right.
please give us a insight
Right.
into it?
Right. So, okay, that's an interesting question, at least as far as the Afghan theater goes. So, even when the
Yeah,
Taliban was just developing in the late 80s, early 90s, and so on and so forth, their stronghold, like today, at that time was also southern Afghanistan. That's where
correct.
tribally they could exist without any repercussions or too many repercussions. Of course, there are going to be some repercussions. But the northern they went, the tribes changed, the Hekmatayars came through,
Correct, correct.
the northern lions came through, and so on and so forth.
Dostum.
Dostum came through, right? So
Yeah.
there were all these sort of pockets that were started building. But southern Afghanistan, they were fairly okay. This is the Taliban land, and we can sort of, or at least operate fairly safely from here. Uh, when you're talking about political vacuums, Afghanistan didn't have any political vacuums because these tribal
Correct.
areas were politics. This
Mhm.
was politics. People, state structure, democracy, dictatorship is a construct that's not necessarily applicable to everything, right? If you
Mhm.
go to Saudi Arabia, what is Saudi Arabia? House of Saud is a tribe. Is they are sitting on top of all other tribes. Why they so fiercely protect the House of Saud? Why does America so fiercely protect the House of Saud? Is because they know if this descends into something, it's going to be a forever war. It's not going to stop. So you need to have the centralization of the House of Saud to make sure that it doesn't explode. And at that point of time, if you go to the Carter regime, the Reagan regime in the US, when oil was absolutely critical to their economy. It's not right now absolutely critical because they're self-sufficient to a certain extent, and it's a transitional economy going into renewables and stuff. But at that point of time, where American foreign policy was to protect oil fields in Middle East so that their supply remains. And so a lot of that architecture was built to keep certain tribes empowered so that the other tribes don't basically come to for their throats and they can manage the entire sort of system, and the Americans only have that one tribe to deal with and they're not dealing with 50 tribes such like you have to do in Afghanistan. If you see Afghanistan, the Taliban has done their talks with the Americans in Qatar, and they have agreed to a very flimsy sort of, which is not a peace agreement, it's a withdrawal agreement, but they've agreed to it with each other. Now, when you come to the intra-Afghan talks, absolute chaos. There's no sort of semblance to anything what is happening. Why? Because it's a tribal society. Every local tribe leader sees himself as the leader of that particular region. That particular region will then have to be properly represented in a powerful situation, in a powerful seat in the parliament, if there is to be a centralized government, right? So a dostum will say, look, I will help you guys make this happen, make this coalition happen. You give me defense ministry. Right. The Hekmatyar will say something else. The smaller tribes will say something else. And you will have to please all of them. Ultimately, when you do that, and if you end up pleasing all of them, what will happen? Ghani will have no power. How will he govern with Hekmatyars and Dostums of the world? So it's the Afghan landscape is a completely requires a whole separate approach of how you study this. It's completely different from the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Now, I very quickly come to ISK, so the Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan. ISK is initially when it came up as a brand was basically Pashtun fighters that had been displaced from Pakistan near the Durand line after Pakistan had this Zarb-e-Zarb kind of military operation against militants. In Fatah, in Waziristan, North Waziristan.
Serbians.
Yeah, Zarbias, sorry. Yeah. And when they did that, which they did under American pressure, all the fighters that were surviving the onslaught were pushing themselves into across the Durand line into Afghanistan for safety. Now, all the villages around the Durand line, right, are also Pashtun. So there was a sympathy within those villages of these fighters who were coming through. So these fighters managed to create these sort of refugee colonies amongst these villages that have been there for centuries as Pashtun villages. Now, these villages, of course, being villages and not worldly to how people like TTP work, for example, said, okay, fine, you can stay here and all that kind of stuff. So while staying in these villages, they started building ecosystems, madrasas. They started basically, rounding up finances, rounding up guns, and so on and so forth to continue what they've already always known of what they do. So, and the easiest way when you've been displaced from your strongholds in Pakistan, you are in Taliban territory. The easiest way to create a wedge of capacity and fear at that time was to wear the Islamic State T-shirt. You wear that, and suddenly, even if you don't have the capacity, the other side thinks you have the capacity, right? So you have that sort of you don't need to prove yourself. The world suddenly knows Islamic State is there now, right? So these guys are Islamic State. We know that. Of course, that shines a light on you, which has a whole other repercussions come into play. But these are mostly basically displaced Pashtun fighters that were pushed into Afghanistan during that time, and they took up the ISIS patch because more than anything else, they don't know what else to do. The economy in Afghanistan is fighting, or you grow poppy. So it's either drugs or mujahids. There's no third thing there. So so even if you are a Pashtun fighter displaced in Afghanistan from Pakistan at that period of time, this was 2016, 2017, and someone says, I'll give you $150 a month, come fight for my group, which is part of the Islamic State. You'll do it. That's how that's how it got created there. And later on, ISK also started getting internal factions, internal fights between warlords. There were some who were more willing to take cash and guns from the Pakistani ISI. The others who were much more ingrained in ISIS thinking of not taking help from Pakistan because they're American backed, refused to do so. And again, it came down to who was what. The ones that were more receptive to Pakistan, for example, who was arrested after the Gurdwara attack in Kabul, were Pashtuns. And the guys who said, no, we should not take money and guns from the Pakistan were Uzbeks and Tajiks and, coming from sort of other ethnic backgrounds and other backgrounds and other political realities. So, even ISK, there are no easy answers inside. It's a very it's a big faction, and you need to know that what commander is loyal to what within that framework.
So I have this question about we have seen this. I was listening to Rukmini as well. So she was talking about remote control terrorism. Even in fact, you also mentioned in some of that ISIS has a manual. I mean, don't have to send foreign fighters to a land to have launch an attack, to have an attack as well. So they have ISIS inspired attack as well. So they have a manual as well how to launch an attack or how to have an attack as well. So having said that attacks now are more flexible, that people does not have to travel to Khilafat to be an ISIS fighter right now. They can sit here and can have an online manual and download the online manual and be a fighter. So why, in spite of so much technology and India being one of the highest Muslim population in the world with having 200 plus million Muslims, have less number of ISIS inspired attacks?
Yeah. Okay, so again, that's a very commonly question asked to me, at least. I always say there is no single answer that I know of. It's a collection of realities. It's a collection of socio-economic realities, collection of political realities. If you see, even radicalization within India has different spheres to it. The radicalization in Kashmir is very different to the radicalization we see in Uttar Pradesh. Is very different to the radicalization we see in Kasaragod in Kerala. So the religion may be the same, but within that umbrella, there are a lot of disparities, disagreements, and you know, and approaches that do not conglomerate anywhere as one, right? So there is no sort of semblance. We all now believe on the same thing. That doesn't work out in the Indian diaspora. The Kashmiri radicalization is the Kashmiri radicalization, right? So we have given, have we? I mean, leave alone foreign fighters. We've not seen fighters from Uttar Pradesh going to Kashmir to fight, barring one or two cases. We've not seen that. Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and West Bengal together make a chunk of the 200 million Muslim population. I think 70 million is just these three states or something, 60 million or something. How many of these people have we seen go fight in Kashmir? Because they don't find any relation to what the Kashmir fight is about. The Kashmiris are fighting about their land, their economy, their resources, right? Then again, not fighting about Islam. They're fighting about the land, and which is why we've never seen any inward movement within India going to Kashmir to fight. We've seen more movement from Maharashtra and Kerala of people going and trying to join Islamic State rather than people actually going from Kerala and Maharashtra to go fight in Kashmir. We've not seen that. So so it's a whole bunch of things. There's a very good, very short paper by Talmiz Ahmad which came out some time ago on why Indian Muslims don't radicalize. Again, if you read that and your viewers read that, you will realize that even a scholar like Ahmad himself is unable to just pinpoint one or two things. It's a multitude of things. It has the fact that, as I said, semblance to conflict zones such as Kashmir in hinterland India doesn't really exist. It's seen as a far off sort of conflict happening. It is seen as something that affects them economically and politically more than just religiously. If you see, Ahmed also talks about the fact that democracy plays a big part in it. The fact that people can have freedom of economic choice. Of course, we can debate this of how much economic choice, but people have freedom of economic choice. People have freedom of movement. People have, you can go to Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, be Shia, Sunni, Sufi, really no one cares. Um, uh, and you are as much you have as much access to the Indian IT growth story as anyone else does in India. So it's a whole bunch of things, right? I think everyone, the Indian Muslim population since the 90s has been as much as a participant of trying to move into the middle class as any other Indian has, and people have been busy with it. So it's a whole bunch of reasons. But as if you are talking, let's say only from an Islamic perspective, Indian Islam is very Indian Islam. It may have some sort of semblances with Shias going to Najaf in Iraq on pilgrimage, or going to or Muslims going to Mecca for Hajj, and so on and so forth. But beyond that, they are not interested in joining the local wars in the Middle East. They are not interested in joining the Mujahids in Afghanistan. If you see the number of Indians who joined the Afghan jihad was negligible. I think the only few that did were from ones who were residing in Saudi and UAE and so on and so forth. And how radicalization takes place there is quite different to how radicalization takes place here. So there's no one reason there. There's a whole multitude of things.
So this is a field which constantly gets updated, and probably I think so that what you've written in your book will also you have to update late. I mean, at a point of time, obviously. So looking at the recent events, whether it's the verdict on Babri Masjid, or whether it's the lockdown on Kashmir, or the failure of the local militants group in Kashmir and the Delhi riots, does this lead you to have a more radicalization chances of having more radicalization in India? That's the one question. And a bit follow up to the last thing is we get to know a lot of foreign fighters that who travels to Islamic State is radicalized by watching videos of Al-Waqi. And most of his videos are talking about jihad. People, a lot of people motivated by that. So does that maybe can it be a fact that a lot of Indian diaspora audience does not get motivated by the kind of language he uses or the way he preaches, and people does not even travel to the ISIS because of his stance, which not being encouraging enough for these people in India right now.
Right. Okay. I mean, if you could you just repeat the first part of the question?
So the first part I'm telling is, are the radicalization chances are more following the incidents of Babu
Right.
Masjid Kashmir?
Right. Okay. So, look, theoretically, I mean, it's difficult to quantify it in any manner, right? I mean, if you see it from the perspective of narratives, you would imagine so. But did we see an increase in sort of Indian fighters going and fighting wars elsewhere in the name of Islam, or even conducting warfare within India after the initial Babri Masjid demolition? They were, the Babri Masjid demolition did push some people from the Indian Muslim community to join groups in Kashmir, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. The AQIS chief who died a couple of months back was from Uttar Pradesh. And if you see his profile, he mentioned Babri Masjid demolition as something that had a profound effect on him, because he was quite young at that time, and he, being from Uttar Pradesh, saw it happening in front of him. So it's a possibility. Like during the Delhi riots that took place a couple of months back, pro-Islamic State propaganda released a very India-specific magazine called Voice of Hind, and they hadn't done this before. They hadn't done this, whether Babri Masjid or lynching cases that have happened in India the past couple of months. That has not happened. So I mean, you can clearly, in a hyper-connected world, in a world where everyone is now on smartphones. I think just yesterday there was a study. Now rural India has more smartphones than urban India. The reach being there, we may see sort of newer propaganda outlets being released to try and drive a wedge between communities in India. That may happen. So even if you see the first issue of Voice of Hind, which was released just as the last few days of the Delhi communal violence, you can sort of make note that this is done in a very haphazard manner. It's not the finesse of usual Islamic State propaganda that comes through. It's been done very quickly. And you realize why it's done very quickly is because they wanted to take full advantage of the situation that existed in the national capital at that point of time. Lynching cases happening in Muzaffarpur or something else happening in another sort of rural part of India. Till some level, communal violence in India or incidents of communal violence in India is an accepted norm kind of thing. This happens in this country. Since the partition, there are a lot of unresolved issues within communities, within geographies, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the national capital, to the camera specifically, everyone from the New York Times to BBC to local channels were picking it up. It was big news everywhere. And that is the time these guys realized we will drop our first issue now. And if you see inside the issue, it has the cover. The cover is from the Delhi riots itself, right? And inside, the issue is very interesting because from an argumentative point of view, the issue criticizes the leadership, Narendra Modi, Amit Shah, so on and so forth, but also criticizes Kanhaiya Kumar, OIC, and so on and so forth. So every political spectrum is criticized. And the issue asks the Muslims of India that why do you take this lying down all the time? Are you not tired of this? So they want the Indian Muslims to rise from, again, a universal Islamic Ummah perspective, which is going back to the original ideology of the Islamic State, right? So they are not saying that vote for the other person or vote for someone else and not the right-wing politics of India and all. They are saying push back against the norms of democracy or the idea of democracy, because this in Islamic law is now not how governance should be. The governance should be one Islamic state. So now, if you see this this line of argumentation, and try to sell it to an Indian audience. I'm not sure they're going to find many people accepting this even in the Indian Muslim community, because again, this is not something they've grown up with. This works in places such as the United Kingdom, for example, where the Muslim community is largely based on immigration. They're all migrants. They came in the 40s and the 30s, and that assimilation process is still taking place. Why did so many people join Islamic State from Belgium, from France? It's an assimilation problem. It's that they are considered not natural to that land. That's not the case in India, right? The Indian Muslims are from here. This is where their centuries old history is. So there are a whole bunch of issues here. Now, whether it can become a problem of radicalization, I mean, of course it can, but it hasn't in the past. So some things will have to drastically change within the Muslim society of India to actually for that to actually happen at any sort of scale.
So the other part about Alwar al-Awaki.
All right, about Al-Awlaki. Again, coming back to my point about Al-Awlaki's popularity amongst Muslims living in Europe, in the US, and so on and so forth, was because his sermons, his lectures were much more popular before. Were also popular before YouTube became a thing. They were being distributed through cassette tapes and VHS and so on and so forth. Again, largely in radicalized sections of British society, for example. Right, radicalization in UK is a very untapped area of conversation and expertise in when we are discussing these kind of things from an Indian context, for example. Right, of how communities specifically in England were radicalized through the 80s and through the 90s. If you see the number of people who traveled to Afghanistan to try and join the Mujahideen and the Taliban against the Soviets, and if you try to see how many people actually went from Europe, it really comes off as quite shocking, because they have all the indicators working for them, the economic indicators, the political stability indicators, and so on and so forth. But the assimilation part never worked out for them very well. They were still living in self-contained ghettos of where only, let's say, Pakistani Muslims are residing, people from other and so on. So Al-Awlaki found, he got popular there. He didn't get. I have very rarely come out of any radicalization cases in India where they said, "Yeah, we watched Al-Awlaki videos and they were absolutely fantastic, and now I want to go and join Al-Qaeda and so on." So his videos, from a global perspective, were a game changer as far as recruitment goes and sort of selling the idea of radicalization goes. But I don't think it really applies to the Indian context so much.
So there is another state, which is another country. But let's go away from home for a bit and focus on Maldives. So Maldives has actually the per capita highest number of people joining ISIS, and it has a similar social structure, if not social structure, economic structure as Kerala. The Kerala state is a lot of people working in the Middle East who come back home and radicalize. But if for the matter of fact the population of Maldives is less, and that's the reason probably the number might be more. But do you see Kerala in future might be the next Maldives of more people joining ISIS?
No, I think the number of cases have really declined since the past 2 years now. You have to remember that majority of the Kerala pro-Islamic State cases were cases of people wanting to travel abroad and join Islamic State, the Khilafat. They were more sort of interested in living in the territory rather than committing crimes in Islamic State name in India, surviving and managing to basically just while away in an Indian jail. That was not that's not what they wanted to achieve out of this. If they were radicalized from an Islamic State perspective, their aim was to go travel and live in the caliphate, not conduct operations here. We saw that. We saw a couple of families getting successful and managing to make it to Afghanistan. We saw a couple of them also die in Afghanistan fighting for Islamic State Khorasan. We saw people like Shafi Armar who managed to who was Indian Mujahideen and then managed to join ISIS in Afghanistan and then made his way to Syria also, and apparently died in an attack there. So we've seen these kind of things, and joined in the sense that, not just posted that I mean that shows you an intent of radicalization and sympathy for a group, but it's not a terror act of terror in any shape or form. So and that's very important to sort of separate, because that is why some of these states are now developing de-radicalization programs and stuff, which is a whole different. But I think in our 2019 we only added one case. We also right at the end of it. So we didn't have any major cases or cases by numbers going beyond 2017. So I think once the taps were closed of people's ability to travel into Syria and Iraq from Turkey specifically, which was the sort of opening gateway between 2014 and 2017. A lot of people who may be sort of thinking about it, that I would like to go and live there, once they found out they actually can't do that, I back into their society, with life, their jobs, whatever they were doing at that point of time.
But but it can be lone wolf attacks as well, right? Because it's difficult to intercept them. So people might be going for lone wolf attacks. It's not that they have to basically like have a conversation in those chat rooms to go to Khilafat. So, but that might just go evade the security position. The security persons might not know about that, of the lone wolf attacks.
Yeah, I mean that's always a possibility, and that's not an India thing. I mean, surveillance and intelligence, especially human surveillance and intelligence, is a very difficult thing to do. Even tracking people online is a difficult thing to do. If you want extra details of someone who's posted something objectionable or a terror activity on Facebook, you can't just email Facebook and they'll send you the details. There's a whole governmental process that takes about 4 to 5 months for that information to come through. 4 to 5 months in a counter-terror operation is, land and space kind of thing. So there are a lot of challenges. No one is denying it, and we've seen. If you see the 2019 December attack on London Bridge in London by Usman Khalid, if I remember correctly. This guy was arrested for radicalization charges, went through a de-radicalization program and a rehabilitation program, came out of that where the government thought, the intelligence and the police thought that he was safe enough to be let go on parole. And what did he do? He stabbed two people to death on London Bridge. Because he was radicalized. So he managed to sort of manipulate his way through these checks and balances that had been created, and still committed the attack that he had committed. So it's there is no sure shot way of basically saying the lone wolf attack will not happen. But the interesting part here is that lone wolf attacks in India have actually not happened. So if you go through, like I did, through a lot of case studies that have happened in India, one of the things which is, I think, a very Indian thing is that when they decided that they want to commit an attack in the name of Islamic State or for Islamic State, they start looking for a group to do it in. They are too scared or feel vulnerable doing it alone. And not for the lack of trying. Shafi Armar, who was Yusuf al-Hindi online, trying to radicalize people in India, got one guy from Bengal and told him, look, your task is to basically buy machetes. This was when, the secular bloggers in Bangladesh were being attacked a lot. And journalists and so on and so forth. And he said, you buy a machete and you conduct an attack in a busy market. So kill 2-3 people using your machete and all that kind of stuff. And the guy he was trying to ask doing this, he went out, he checked out, he bought some knives and so on and so forth. But this guy kept on going back to Shafi Armar and saying, all this is fine, brother. I understand what you're saying. When will my passport come? I want to come to the caliphate. I don't want to do this machete thing, knife thing here in Bengal. I want to come to the caliphate and live there. And one of the biggest deterrent factors of any of these guys actually managing to go abroad was the fact that just how tight it is to get a passport in India. It's not easy. You need permanent addresses, you need bank statements, and a lot of these guys had neither. So once they realize that the passport is not coming, the money is not coming, they are not actually going to make it to Syria or Iraq. All the propositions that were given to them, which are similar to the proposition given to lone wolves attack committers in Europe, they were just not. They went back to their lives. They stopped talking to Yusuf al-Hindi slowly, and it just sort of faltered through. And these kind of examples are peppered throughout, where people on individually want to do something, but immediately start looking for companions of similar ideologies to do it with. But they will not do it alone.
All right, sir. So before we move to the final concluding question, I have one small question with regard to the whole Afghan theater and the IS Khorasan. So, like in my previous visits to Afghanistan, there has always been some or the other incidents that have always taken place by the Islamic State of Khorasan, especially the recent Kabul mosque Gurdwara attack, and previously there were a couple of journalists who were targeted by the ISK. So, how does the future of Khorasan, ISK Khorasan, looks like, with special emphasis on the multiple groups they have collaborated with, like IMU from Uzbekistan and other stuff. So, how does the future of the whole Khorasan movement looks like?
Again, it's very difficult to predict anything in Afghanistan. Everything works in such gray areas there. But one of the interesting things when ISK started coming to prominence is when they started attacking Kabul a lot. So a lot of attacks that were happening in Kabul, they started taking responsibility for it. And this was when the Taliban was negotiating in Doha with the Americans. And the Taliban went into a hyperdrive, making sure that the Americans know that it was not them. And letting the ISK takes some of the heat of it. Now there are, if you talk to the Afghan security apparatus and stuff, they will say, look, a lot of time the Taliban will come to commit an attack and say ISK did it. ISK will commit an attack and say the Taliban did it. So it ultimately it these are all information that either the security establishment knows for itself or the groups knows for themselves, and it's very difficult to sort of decipher between the two. But the important part that comes into play here is that when ISK started attacking Kabul, it raised a lot of red flags because Kabul is a place which is almost exclusive to Taliban for attacking. It's not easy to attack the national capital unless you exactly know what you're doing, unless you know the correct people, and unless you know that the Taliban is not going to thwart your attempts on while you're doing that. And once that question started those questions started to come forward, people started peeling off more and more layers of what ISK is. For example, a lot of the initial attacks that the Islamic State Khorasan was taking credit for in Kabul ultimately turned out to be the Haqqanis. Now, the Haqqanis have good access to Kabul. Why? Because there is Pakistan involved. So, again, we're coming back to the whole sort of long debate of what does ISK constitute. I mean, if you see again the divisions between ISK run by commanders from either the Tajiks or the Uzbeks and so on and so forth, I really think those are the guys more concentrated on the northern parts of the country in Nangarhar province and so on and so forth. When it comes to then we are, I think, entering into the territory of the former TTP people working perhaps with the Pakistanis or by themselves also to sort of make sure that something that may be transpiring in Kabul between the Americans and the Indians and the Afghans, it doesn't take place. So every attack that happens in Kabul on ISK should ideally be seen as an individual attack. Where is it coming from? Why did it happen? And what did it target? And that's why when we're talking about the Gurdwara attack in Kabul, there was the leader was not a Tajik or a Uzbek. He was a Pashtun.
He was an Indian. There was an Indian involved in the incident,
Yeah,
if I'm
yeah,
not wrong, from a man from from Kerala.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Okay, so we come to the concluding part. So before I conclude, I just want to ask you about your future project. So what's your plan for the future? Are you writing another book?
Uh, a book
Or,
right now.
or
It's
is it
not
too
in
early?
no. I mean, yeah, I'm thinking about it. It is too early to start writing. I'm still recovering from the last one. But there are some ideas in my head which I'm looking at. But as I said, our research still continues. We did a long paper on Islamic State in Kerala with our partners in RSI Singapore. We are just completing a paper program created by the center and state of how they work out and whether they even fit in or not. So immediately right now, the sort of trajectory of the research continues. I think in India, research on issues such as Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth is fairly basic and superficial. And I'm talking about the public discourse. I'm sure it's much better within the but these are some of the corrective measures that as researchers we are taking to address in a much more manner to understand why is happening in Kerala and why is ISIS radicalization happening in Kerala and not in Kashmir, which is quite surprising to a lot of people. So at the moment, that's a bunch of stuff that I'm working in my mind.
And do you want to give any advice or any like tips to all people who want to cover ISIS in India?
Uh, it's not just about ISIS. Whenever you are working on groups such as ISIS or Taliban or Al-Qaeda and all, the devil is always in the details. You spend a lot of time understanding your subject matter, like go obsessively deep into it, and because only then you have to realize all these groups work in very confined and gray spaces. Whatever they show you on top is what they want to show you on top, and what they want you to consume. It's the story always changes once you see through those blinders and how these groups work. And I think the Afghan example that we've been talking about is a very pertinent one in this. That as many layers as you peel, there's something new that turns up. So be obsessive about whatever you are working on, especially in this field, so that you add better stuff to the public discourse rather than a lot of superficial, opinion editorials that we end up consuming on these matters.
Okay, so I'll just end with I don't have a physical copy of your book, unfortunately. I have a Kindle, so I will just show our audience. So this is the book. I hope is it seen? Okay, I think my background is similar to the color of your book. Actually, it's black, so it cannot be seen. But okay, let me try to show. It's not.
Yeah,
It's not actually visible. But if you have a copy, you can show it to the audience in front of you.
okay, let me. I think I do. Yeah. All right. So this is the book for everyone who wants to go and check it out. It's in all major bookstores and online everywhere. So go get it.
And it's definitely worth the read. And I hope I'm pretty much sure people will learn a lot from it. Thank you so much, Kabir, for giving your time and giving us a sneak peek of what goes inside your head, who's churning articles and research papers all the time.
Thank you so much.
We hope to host you sometime soon in our webinar again. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a lovely day.
Thanks everyone for watching. Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.